So, welcome to this Intelligence Squared debate with Henry Dimbleby, whose modest ambition is to save both our health and our planet. And he is co founder of Leon, the director of the Sustainable Restaurant Association. He was the government's food czar at DEFRA, where he published this widely acclaimed national food strategy before quitting in frustration. And I have to say, I have read your strategies, as you know. There are very few government papers that I read back to back and keep by my
Thank
bedside.
you.
Yours is one. You also co-authored the school food plan, and I have eaten your school food, which transforms what children eat at school. And your new book is Ravenous, How to Get Ourselves and Our Planet into Shape, which has the most fantastic picture of quite an edible donut, I think, although it could have been a bagel. And it is also in the Sunday Times bestseller list, only beaten by the air fryer cookbooks, which we are going to ignore. Although your next book, as you say, is going to be an air fryer book. So you get two in the bestsellers list at once. But thank you very much for joining us. And our event tonight is going to run for an hour. I'm going to ask questions for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then it's over to the audience to ask questions. And you can start asking them now, actually, by clicking on the Ask Question button underneath the video screen. And then you type in your question. If you want your name to be mentioned, type it in the box, then press send, and I will try to remember to mention it. And if you feel as anything at all that I have not covered, feel free to go for it. You'll probably have much better questions, and I will look at them at the end and go through as many as possible. I think we can start very soon. The audience are supposed to be using the hashtag IQ2 to tweet, if you can tweet through the process. Probably Henry and I will have to focus on what we're talking about. So we could start now. I really want to start by saying that food has just become so complicated for most of us. And the FT said this weekend that no one knows what a healthy breakfast is anymore. That, you know, you've got all chickens have avian flu, the eggs are costing a fortune, bacon is injected with sodium nitrate, then fruit juices contain all these sugars, nuts and muesli are flown from around the world. You know, do you have almond milk? Do you have oat milk? It's quite difficult. So what do you eat for breakfast, Henry?
Well, this morning I had for breakfast some sourdough toast with sauerkraut on it, but my wife thinks this is absolutely disgusting. But I normally have, actually, funny enough, quite a continental breakfast. So I'll have tomatoes, chickpeas, coffee, whatever's in the fridge, which is ridiculously on brand, but it also happens to be true.
And do you ever have an egg McMuffin, or have you never had one of those?
So, funnily enough, when I was a child, I used to like Burger King rather than McDonald's. And one of the reasons that we set up Leon was because both John and he used to like McDonald's, I used to like Burger King. And we remembered the excitement of those restaurants when we were kids. Both of us used to, before term, go out to a movie and then go and have fast food. But recently, when I've had McDonald's, it is your palate kind of moves away from that, and it is, you know, you could eat the thing that you can eat it with your gums without your teeth, and the sweetness of the bread I just find pretty unpalatable at this stage in life.
And having written the National Food Strategy, do you really understand now why the British have such a peculiar attitude to food? We sort of lost the plot. We can't take it seriously. We don't pay enough for it. Why specifically is it America and Britain that seem to have done so badly?
Well, you know, it's America and Britain, Germany a bit behind. I think that the story of the UK, there are kind of a few overlaying things. And if you want to understand how different the UK is from, say, France and Spain, 50%, 7% of the food that we eat is highly processed. Italy and Spain, it's kind of in the low teens, and France is slightly higher above that. So we do eat a very different diet. I think it goes back to, first of all, the Industrial Revolution. So when we basically moved our citizens into towns at the end of the 19th century. France, by contrast, had about the same percentage of their population in towns as we did at the end of the 19th century in the early 60s. So they stayed near where their food was grown for much longer. And at the same time, because we'd moved the labour out of the fields, we then imported much more of our own food. So we, by the beginning of the Second World War, only had only produced 30% of our own food. It's much more now. We produce over 60% of our own food. So we dislocated our population from the countryside, and from that point, there are all politicians basically from that point through the Boer War and the First World War were very worried about how bad our diet is. Periodically, they've intervened because the poor were not able to eat good food. They were eating bread and tea and other things. And then I think the second thing that happened is we created, because we were more American, we were more market driven, we created this kind of super powered food industry that has really turned up the dial, and we could talk about this a bit later, in terms of how it markets and sells as food. And that didn't happen in the same way in Southern Europe. So I think there are a kind of combination of historical factors and then a culture that meant the government in other countries, in Japan, in South Korea, in Spain, in France, the government have tried to do more to encourage a good food culture than we have in this country.
I was going to ask you why you thought in the last year, when inflation's gone up by 16% food inflation, how that has affected people. Has it made them eat more sensibly, or do you think actually it's exacerbated the problem because people are just looking for very cheap ways of feeding their families?
Well, we don't know. We don't know is the answer. So we haven't got good data on how diets have shifted. What we do know is that in a cost of living crisis, food is typically the first thing to go. So when you have your fixed costs in your household, your rent or your mortgage and your heating bills and so forth, it is the reason there is what people call food poverty is not because it's anything other than poverty, but it's because food is the thing that people can skip.
Mm.
And the one piece of data that we have seen is that more houses, which is now measured by the government, more houses, more people are skipping meals as a result of financial constraints. And you would expect in that scenario to see what happens if you look at diets across the piece. Diets are pretty bad across the piece, but there is a skew to poor diet in people who haven't got a lot of money, and that tends to be because, for example, they and there's good data on this. If you haven't got a lot of money and you want to feed your family, you want to feed them something that you know that they will eat. You want to go for the blockbusters because you can't afford to feed your children, for example, healthily, and then if they don't like it, feed them something else. So we know that the cost of living has increased the number of people skipping meals. We don't know yet whether it's changed what they eat, but we would expect it to make diets slightly worse.
And what about the war in Ukraine? Because in some ways that may have helped in that we've had to start looking at our own food. So I know the government said let them eat turnips, but there is a sense where we might actually start eating a bit more healthily if we do look around locally for local produce rather than relying on food flying
Yeah, I
in.
mean, I found the whole debate about whether it is acceptable to ask people to eat more turnips incredibly frustrating. So there is, if you step right back, the reason that Ukraine is so important is because it has incredibly fertile soil, and we have a population on the planet now that exists in areas where the soil in that area would be unable to feed the population of that country. So, for example, Egypt, which imports a lot of wheat from Ukraine, even if you farmed it incredibly intensively, the land in Egypt would only be able to support half the population, so less than half the population. And that is because we've got very good at distributing and storing food. So that is a decision that we have made, maybe subconsciously as a race, that we will move food from productive areas to unproductive areas. Here in the UK, we are actually pretty protected from that because we have pretty productive soil. We produce about 60% of our own food. If we had to, and the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs did a study on this, we could quite quickly ramp up our own production to feed the whole population from British soil if we ate less meat because it's inefficient. So what actually I think you're seeing at the moment, the real underlying thing, obviously wars are bad. And if you're Egypt, that is concerning. And there are things that we talk about that Egypt might be thinking about in the future in the book. But for us, I think the biggest worry is climate change. So the food system is by far the biggest cause of the destruction of nature. And after energy, it is the second biggest cause of climate change. It emits 20 to 30% of greenhouse gases. And what we saw earlier this year in Morocco, which was a failure of a kind of weird freak weather event, that is going to happen more often. And the way that we eat is actually imperiling the way we eat. So we shouldn't be talking about whether we can eat turnips in whether it's okay to tell people to eat turnips in winter. What we should be thinking about is how can we make our food system less environmentally destructive? And it might not just be, that Moroccan event was quite mild, but if you look at, say, rice, the biggest exporter of rice to the world is the Mekong Delta, half of which will be underwater if sea levels rise a meter. So for me, the big issue with food security is climate and biodiversity, and that's what we should be focusing on, not whether it's okay for a minister to tell people to eat turnips, which is very funny. It's a good debate, but it's not particularly relevant.
What I really like about your book is that how to get yourself and the planet into shape is actually the same way, isn't it? They're not actually pulling against each other. So the fact that we eat 57% of our food is all deeply unnutritious and fast food is also the way that we are wrecking the planet. So what are we actually doing to our bodies when we're eating that kind of food? Because you write about it very well. How are we destroying them?
Well, it's not entirely overlapped. So I'm sure we might come on to this. So I do make the argument that the fact that so much meat is eaten in processed form, that you could substitute meat in processed products for other kinds of protein, and you wouldn't improve our health, but you would massively improve the impact on the environment.
Right.
But in terms of our health, there is the one of the oldest or most ancient pieces of evolution in our body is the amygdala in the brain, which actually evolved in prehistoric marine worms. And this drives our most fundamental desires and appetite. And it is where the hormones of appetite meet the brain and affect our behavior. And we talk in the book about how powerful this is, this urge. And we give the example of the Chilean rugby players who are documented very well by Piers Paul Reed in his book Alive, who crashed in the Andes and they survived amazingly, ran out of food. And the urge to eat was so strong that they ended up eating their family and friends, first their flesh, which they cut from the bodies with the glass from the windows of the plane, and then their organs, and then their lungs, and then their brains. So our appetites will make us do extraordinary things. And this processed food that we currently eat, that the 57%, most of that is designed in such a way that it is irresistible to that appetite. That appetite evolved to make us go to quite great lengths to seek out highly calorie dense food. And when we eat that food, it fills us up less often and it less quickly, and we eat more of it. And companies spent more and more money marketing that food and developing it. We've eaten more and we've got sick. And that sickness, to answer your question, there is part of it is just overweight and the weight that puts the pressure that puts on your body, and that can create cancers and diabetes, heart disease. But actually, the quality of the food and the way in which it messes around, for example, with our insulin production, means that in the States now, where 40% of people are pre-diabetic, there are a significant number of what they call the skinny ill. So people who have
Mm.
diabetes without being overweight because of the way this very sugary, fatty food interacts with our bodies. And fun enough, those are the people, if you're diabetic and you're skinny, you're more likely to die of it than if you're overweight because you don't you don't spot that you're
Mm.
sick.
It's that 2-to-1 ratio that you talk about breast milk, which is so true,
Ye-
isn't it? The idea
yes,
that
yeah.
it's just perfectly formulated for ice cream,
There's
and it
yes.
is
So
deeply
there's a
cynical.
2 to 1. There's a ratio of sugar to fat to salt, and there are various different ones. In breast milk, the ratio is two sugar, one fat, and that is particularly it's a bliss point, and it's in ice cream. Fun enough, it's also in crisps if you take the carbs to be the the sugar, and it's in all sorts of foods. And actually, the work of Kevin Hall, who was the first person to prove in the States that this ultra processed food was really bad for us, he has now identified specific ratios that really of carbs to fat to salt that don't exist in unprocessed food. So there is something about this food that literally interacts with this marine worm brain, this most fundamental part of our kind of drive to live, that is causing a lot of trouble and causing us harm. And it's not just, we talk in the book, it's not just us who are stuck in the junk food cycle. Those food companies, if they decided not to do that individually, the CEOs, they would just lose share to another food company or be fired. So it's a systemic problem. This reaction between the commercial incentive of companies and this ancient evolved appetite.
And the problem is, it's like an addiction, really, isn't it? But unlike, say, cigarettes or alcohol or gambling, you can't really live without it. So it's not like you can go cold turkey and just not eat anything at all. That's the problem, isn't it? You have to learn to live with it and to eat it and to eat sensibly. And what you come up with solutions, what kind of solutions can the government come up with? I mean, they obviously haven't come up with enough, but stuff like portion control is really important. How do you get companies to produce the right portion controls?
Well, it's very difficult, and if you look, for example, the new wave of attack on this appetite is the delivery companies, and it is very hard for them to give us portions that would be reasonable. And there's good evidence that we overeat massively when we eat delivered food. It's very hard for them to give us portions that would be reasonable because we would complain that they weren't big enough. But basically, there are two ways that you can tackle the health problem. If the feedback loop that's going wrong is the feedback between our appetite and the commercial incentives of companies, you can you can change either of those. So to change the commercial incentives of companies, there are all sorts of things you can do. You can restrict advertising, you can put into place reformulation taxes, you can restrict what can be marketed to children, just to improve the environment a bit better. And uh, we argue in the book that that is what you should do, but we also recognize that what I think is actually more likely to happen is that government will think that stuff's a bit tricky, that's politically difficult, I don't want a nanny state, etc., and they will focus on the appetite. And there are very good drugs now, or very effective drugs, at restricting our appetite. Semaglutide is the name of the drug. Its brand name is Wegovy and Ozempic. It's suddenly been in the press a lot over the last few weeks. And basically, you inject yourself once a week and you feel less hungry. And if you are someone who has struggled with weight all of your life, you have a BMI of over 30, you are very unwell, I think that you should go to your GP, you should look at that option. But what I think is going to happen is that the government whichever government will think actually fixing the underlying problems too hard, and 20 million people will end up permanently on these drugs.
Mm,
There's been reports in the paper recently that Steve Barclay, our current health secretary, has already asked for a paper about how much it would cost to give this drug to 12 million people. And
mm.
there are problems with that. There are two problems I have with that. One is when you give drugs to that many people, the side effects can scare people. You have very low level of side effects, as we have with the vaccine, which make the drug scary to people, which means that people who might actually benefit from it don't want to take it. But the other one is more fundamental, which is, are the hormones of appetite, do, because they evolved, have all sorts of other roles in our body. They're used to balance all sorts of different biological processes in our body. And I think there is a fundamental concern about using a drug that focuses on a certain hormone, GLP-1 in this case, and basically makes you artificially release more of it. Uh, Dealing with a complex system in that way, I think you inevitably will cause uh, unintended side effects down the line. I think it's a really, really dangerous way to solve the problem of a bad food system.
It's also depressing, isn't it, that sense that you're not going to enjoy food anymore. So the people who are on it don't actually really enjoy eating anymore. So you lose that sense of eating for pleasure and enjoyment as well as, to get your nutrients. And I think that in the long term is rather sad, because I think it's one of the aspects that people do enjoy. You really love food, we love cooking. That sense that you're being forced to eat less because you can't really you can't control yourself in any way. That
Yeah,
you
yes.
have
I mean,
all these side effects too.
I'd be quite careful not to impose my values, but definitely, instinctively, I think, God, that's not a world that I
Mm,
would like to live in. Um, and in fact, you mentioned up front, I'd done work for the government before on school food, and one of the things I did was help write the curriculum. And I was really pleased that we managed to sneak in there that the lessons should try and instill a love of cooking, which is one of the great outlets of human creativity, into the curriculum. But I trying to kind of fight against those values of mine. I spoke to a few people who were on semaglutide, and one of whom we quote in the book, who said she doesn't enjoy food as much, but her whole life had been a struggle with food, and she
mm,
just feels released from that struggle. She then rather rudely said, "You should try it." But I do think there are people. If you look at the bell curve of society, our appetites are very different, and so if you are a naturally thin person, you have to imagine how you feel at the end of the day if by mistake you didn't eat for the day,
mm,
and realize that other people feel that when they've eaten, relatively recently. So
mm.
we all have different appetites, and I do think if someone has a particularly strong appetite, if they have a genetic propensity to obesity is somewhere between 40 and 70%, for those people, I can see what would be a bleak existence for me might seem like a blessed relief.
So I did quite a lot of research on the food in Japan, which is also in your book, where they did have quite an overweight nation after the Second World War when they were introduced to American food and Twinkies and chips and burgers, and they did grow it, a bit like we have in the way that we now have. We've gone from 1% being obese in the 50s now to our sort of 30%. And they did crack it by having very much a nanny state, but almost food rationing, that they went back to telling people what to eat. The children all had to eat the same things at food. Do you think we could ever get to that situation in Britain, whereas instead of taking drugs, actually what we do is say to people, this is how you need to eat?
Yes, although I wouldn't put it quite like that, but I think we can change our food culture. So people say, well, why can't, how can we get people cooking from scratch? Can we get people eating better food? Can we change our culture? And people go, no, 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 it's impossible. The genie's out of the bottle. That's never going to happen. But actually, it's happened here. We have created and changed our food culture. And as you say, it's happened in Japan. So Japan's been through, we all think of the Japanese uh, food culture as being kind of God-given, amazing food, and they have 4% of their population is obese. Uh, they have changed their food culture twice. First of all, in the Meiji period, the Meiji Restoration, when they opened up to foreigners, and they saw all these hulking Dutch traders who were the first people to trade with them because they were the only ones, being pragmatic Dutch people, they were the only ones who would stand on the Bible to sign deals. And the Chinese came in and they thought, my God, these people are so strong. We need to do something about it. So the emperor, first of all, decided that he would eat red meat and be public about it, which was taboo at the time. They got the army they created a whole new menu for the army, which included dishes that they stole from all around the world. Katsu curry, for example, was taken from a fried chicken dish with an Indian curry sauce that was served on British naval ships. And then they got those cooks in the army and the navy to broadcast on radio cookery lessons for Japanese houses. And then after the war, they had a similar thing again. So they went from again being very starved. MacArthur came in. They, as you said, the diet began to become quite American, but then they really turned up the dial on creating a Japanese food culture. So both subtly. So, for example, they had quite restrictive agricultural rules to try and maintain this new Japanese cultural diet. They have planning rules that meant that it was quite hard for fast food chains to set up there. But then they also had the Metabo law, which meant that still you get measured by your company once a year, and if you are overweight, you get a bit of help from a dietitian and a bit of advice. So you can, I think, change food cultures, and I think we will in this country. In the end, I think we will realize that we need to. We've done it quite recently. We when I was a journalist in the 90s, we'd just had the first Time Out Food Awards, and we'd had the Eagle Gastropub had opened and Quaglino's had opened, and I was sent by the Telegraph to go and compare British food to French food. And I travelled, on the ferry then across to Paris, and actually, except for about 4 restaurants in London, all the food was better in France. I repeated that journey the other day, and we are now, and I will categorically defend this to anyone who wants to have an argument on it. We have better restaurants than the French. The French have not improved since the 90s. They've sat on their laurels. And I really do think that culture can permeate down, that we can find a food culture in the UK and that we can learn to cook from scratch. But in the meantime, you've still got this 57% of food that's processed. So I think there's kind of 2 transitions that need to happen. One is we need to make the processed stuff less bad, and then the other is we need to focus on, from the bottom up, creating a better culture of cooking and cooking from scratch and feeding our families and eating together, etc. And I don't think that is nuts. I think cultures change all the time.
And that's what's so difficult, isn't it? I mean, I did restaurant reviews at the Telegraph, I think, when you were there, for 10 years. And the food did change dramatically. But what didn't was the discussion around farming, actually. And now we've got a huge discussion going on about whether we want rewilding, whether we want to keep the big agri farms. We've got all the new trade deals going through. And there is a sense that we could actually have more regenerative farming, we could have more sustainable farming, and then we could teach people to eat with local produce and from these farms. And do you think there's any way we're getting closer to that now or not?
I think the farming side is really exciting. So, basically in the book, we say the health problem is caused by this junk food cycle, this feedback loop that's going wrong between appetite and commercial incentives of companies. I think that is tricky to break. The reason that our farming is so destructive is that what the economist Partha Dasgupta called the invisibility of nature. We don't measure nature in any of the systems that we use to measure human success. So you can't count nature in a wallet. It's not in the balance sheet of companies. It's not in the way we measure GDP. And in fact, Dasgupta points out that it's not just not there. We actually subsidize globally activities that destroy nature. Governments do to the tune of about $500 billion a year through subsidies to agriculture, to fishing, and to fossil fuels. So we have an opportunity. The kind of one thing that about Brexit that almost everyone agrees on is that who knows about it, is that we have an opportunity to change that in the UK because we're coming out of the common agricultural policy. So we have an opportunity to pay people not to destroy nature, but to restore it, to give payments for public goods. And I think, and currently the framework the government has is the right one. There are all sorts of ways that it could go wrong. And if you want, we can talk about how it needs to go right. But fundamentally, we have an opportunity to show the world that this is possible. The only thing that is, or there are lots of things that are difficult about it, but the one thing already that has gone slightly wrong is trade deals, because it makes no sense to incentivize our farmers to farm differently and then allow imports of food that is grown to lower standards from abroad. Effectively, you're just moving the problems to a country where you can't see them. And in the Australian trade deal, probably the worst trade deal any country has ever done, according to the Australian press, who were amazed by how bad it was. In that trade deal, that did not protect our farmers. Now, it might not matter with the Australian trade deal because most of their food anyway, for economic reasons, goes to China and is not sold into this market. But if we do similar trade deals with America and Brazil and so forth, we could hobble our own attempt to show the world how it's possible to farm in a more nature-friendly fashion.